people are always searching for this kind of like easy thing, right? And that's what commercialization brings, is like the easy part of it, right? Like, it's easy to smoke weed now. It's easy to get shrooms now. It's easy to do that. Before it wasn't easy. So like, even in that sense, like you were searching for something, right? Like on that journey. And that could tell more about you than actually getting the thing. You know what I mean? Like how far you went to go get those shrooms, you know, to get that experience. And I feel like now once those barriers are kind of away, it starts to, you know, make it easier for people to kind of fall subject to being lazy about their experiences, for sure.
Welcome to the Set and Setting podcast with Madison Margolin. As a journalist, Madison has spent years exploring the intersection of psychedelics, cannabis, and culture. This podcast brings together thought leaders from today's psychedelic renaissance to talk about the role of psychedelics in our inner and outer lives. You can support this podcast and find additional resources at BeHereNowNetwork.com/Madison.
Hi, everyone. Welcome back to Set and Setting podcast. We have Nadir Pearson. He's a New Jersey native and Ivy League graduate, currently serving as co-founder of Hybrid and VP of Business Development at Wiseco. Driven by a mission to make cannabis equitable for Black and Brown communities, Nadir is best known for empowering the next generation of leaders through his work with SMART, Student Marijuana Alliance for Research and Transparency, a national college cannabis organization founded by Pearson to help bridge the gap between cannabis and academia. His notable positions include Deputy Director for New NJ NORML and East Coast Project Lead for Cannaclusive. Nadir's past experience in digital marketing comes from his time with industry giants like High Times and Herb.co. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you, Madison.
So yeah, I've kind of known you through the cannabis space over the past couple of years. I think met you when you were at High Times, if I recall.
Yep. Yes.
So, and you were there as a college student, right? If I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, I was still in undergrad at the time, correct.
So that's really young to get into the cannabis space. So how'd you get here, right? You know, why cannabis, especially starting out so young before you even, graduated?
Yeah, I mean, like many of us now, I guess I call myself a zillennial because I'm like in between Gen Z and millennial. Like I don't identify with the 18-year-olds, but I'm not 28. And so all that to say is, we were in the time of social media, and I was a really curious kid growing up. I was an athlete growing up and played football, basketball, all sports. But and so that kind of kept me away from weed from a long time. But then, by the time high school came, I was like too curious to not like research and hear that it's helping people with cancer, but it's also negative. So those kind of conflicting ideas always led me to like do my own research. And so I used Google. But ultimately, like I wanted to ask my friends, like, can I smoke? Like, can we smoke? And, they were scared to bring it up to me because I was an athlete. So there was like that kind of stigma, and like they didn't know how I would feel. But ultimately, like learning about not only like the health benefits and the ways that it could help people with terminal illnesses, but then, the racism and the history behind it kind of really opened my eyes to be like, oh, wow, like this is a lot more than just a plant, and it really is just a plant, but, in the society sense, right? So, and then I, kind of kept that to myself for a while, just being in the closet stoner. And by the time I was in college, playing Division I football, I was the stoner of my friends, and ultimately had to stop playing football due to concussions. And that was where like my life kind of was like, what's next for you, right? And there was something about weed, and I had watched this Vice episode one time. There's this dude Ross Hudson on there that was like in Barcelona. He was smoking weed as his job. And I was like, get the fuck out of here. Like weed as a job. Like that's like one of the first times that I saw it in a professional sense. And he was like hitting the bongs, like blah, 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 blah. And he's like, oh yeah, very lemony. I'm like, I could do that. So there was just kind of this, one, me seeing Colorado, two, seeing that kind of profession, and three, me being in Rhode Island and in Massachusetts at the time in 2016. I think those were all like a big culmination of why I got into weed. So yeah.
And you, it doesn't take much for any high schooler to kind of discover cannabis and know that it's sort of better than the DARE officers say that it is. Did you have, like, what was your drug education like? I know, like, I'm probably a little bit older than you. I had DARE growing up. Of course, never believed it, but I think they canceled the program. So did you even get that?
No, I did get Dare. See, that's what I'm saying. Like I was still part of that demo. And so we did get Dare. I remember getting like to this day, I remember being at 5th grade, elementary school in Dare. And, the police officer that was on call all the time at our school was the one who taught us. And like the books were cool, right? Like the drugs look cool. Like to be quite frank, right? Like they're like, don't do the ones with Pokemon and don't do the ones with this. I'm like, that looks sick. Like, but obviously we know they were drugs. Didn't know what that meant, right? But he was like, drugs, bad. Don't do the ones with Pokemon. Sick. But yeah, that was my experience in there.
Yeah. And so one question as I was reading your bio, you mentioned working at Wiseco. Can you just explain what that is for everybody?
Yeah. So, I mean, this is probably like the first time on record that I'd have to explain Wiseco. So you got me there. But for folks who are familiar with Hope Wiseman, she's been touted as the youngest Black dispensary owner in the country. And so she's, has Mary Main in Maryland, which is her establishment. And like many of us, we're looking to expand operations. So I've been talking to Hope and we've been longtime friends for a while. And so Wiseco is the parent company for Mary and Main. And a few other operations that will be looking to expand multi-state-wise in the cannabis industry. So I came on as employee number 1. And so I've been serving and helping on the biz dev and partnership side.
Cool. And yeah, I mean, that's something that I kind of wanted to get into is talking about equity within cannabis. So you talk to most cannabis activists and they'll tell you at this point, the legal cannabis industry has been a massive disappointment as far as creating an equitable paradigm for people of color, people who've been underrepresented in the legal space to now be participating in it. So what do you see as sort of the state of cannabis as equity is concerned? And, how are we kind of moving forward, or what are some solutions to dealing with that?
Yeah. I mean, I think it's just kind of like, I would just say double down on what's working and try to cut the fat, in a lot of ways but I guess if I wanted to talk about it kind of like geographically and kind of where I'm seeing wins and, where history is shown on the equity battlefield, I guess it would be like Oakland was kind of the purveyor originally, right, of what equity in cannabis even meant, and then we're seeing, now states like Massachusetts have some provisions like exclusivity on delivery on a license type, which I think is pretty remarkable. And you don't really see that anywhere else in the country. So there's been wins like that around. But to your point, as a whole, what stat that I've been seeing, whether it's true or not, that I've been seeing a lot is like, oh, the 4% of ownership that was Black and brown folks has shrunk now to 2%, which I wouldn't doubt it, right? And I think my difference is I'm a lot more cynical than a lot of people. So even when things, in 2016 and 2017 were a lot more optimistic, capitalism is a very dreary force and powerful in that sense, right? And so I think a lot of tides have pulled to, conventional ways of getting money, conventional ways of like starting businesses, right? And so that's where I think the cultural kind of love and passion that everybody who's been in the industry doesn't meet, right? Like the corporate boardrooms. And that's always been the disconnect on the culture versus corporate side of things. And so in terms of equity, like going forward and where I see like, what I think as a solution is mainly like starting small and consolidation in a good way, right? Like consolidation in a way that, Black and brown operators have to start working together a lot more to potentially raise money together, to potentially, make themselves a more attractive option and be a lot more, I'm very, I would say like just bold and I don't even want to say the word bold, but it's just like to the point with people. And I want to say objective because my opinion is subjective, but I try to be like objective to what is working in business and what is like traditional means and how do we kind of like start our own narrative, but also like try to get some money and get some wins early on because it's, it's a snowball effect that you kind of got to build up to.
I mean, it sounds like you're describing something of a collective model where like if, people banded together and were able to raise money collectively rather than kind of like individuals just competing for the same, investor capital or resources or whatever, you kind of could potentially attract more than individually. Do you agree with that? Or am I reflecting what you're saying?
Yeah, I give you 2 examples, right? Like one, Wiseco and our strategy, right? So right now we're looking to Massachusetts, right, as the next kind of market to expand our operations. And we are partnering with an economic empowerment group out there. And so, yeah, so that's like our model, right? And, our background from the Marion, Maine side of things is retail, is dispensary, right? But we have the opportunity to start going into cultivation, manufacturing, where, we see real long-term potential in the value chain, right? And so in that sense, yeah, we are looking to partners out of state to come in and now say, one, make us have a higher level of expertise on our team. We're not just retailers now. Now we have a cultivation partner. And then additionally to that, right, like they have their own set of business and revenues and things that we can start to match to ours, right? And if there's a way that we can come to terms on, if we raise money together, who gets what, then that could be a really happy marriage, right? And saying now it's two operators for investors' money, not just one, right, that has to go and do something. So that's one example. The other I would give is like our academy, right? And Hillary, you and the team over there, where it's a group of social equity brands, Black and brown folks who are entrepreneurs who are creating really great businesses. And Hillary's job is to like coach them through everything and make sure they get an investment, and also try to be realistic about like not every business. Like we can't, there needs to be more Black and brown businesses, but even in the industry in general, like some are going to fail, right? And so how do we kind of dedicate resources to the ones that are going to win the most? Because for better or for worse, if a Black person fails, it's 2 times as bad. If a Black person wins, it's 2 times as good, right? So I think in that sense, we have to be like, it's not, it's just the reality of like the situation. So.
Yeah, I hear you. I mean, one thing that, with Double Blind that we always try to do is we say that we're kind of expanding the way people think about psychedelics, right? So if you think about the brand and the history and the cultural stereotypes about psychedelics, you think about people like these old white guys from the 60s, pretty much, which, again, I want to really honor those people, Ram Dass, Timothy Leary, Ralph Metzner, Rick Doblin, even people like that. But, at the same time, we're saying like, hey, this is like psychedelics today is sort of the culture is comprised of this kaleidoscope of people who have actually always kind of been in the space. And, everyone has a different way to benefit from these medicines and, so forth. And I feel like with cannabis too, like you think of the legacy of the cannabis plant and so much of the history. I mean, cannabis is way more, I would say, diverse than even psychedelics, or because, technically speak, I mean, actually,
I could
maybe I'll take that back. Actually, no,
okay.
I might take back that statement. I mean,
okay,
if you think about the history of like the synthetic psychedelics that like started off like in
right
laboratories, for instance, like MDMA or LSD or whatever.
Also,
we're talking
educate
about,
me, because I don't know too much about psychedelics, like in the same way that I can talk about cannabis. So
totally. Well, I guess what I'm saying is like if you think about the academic background of psychedelics, we're talking about that cohort of like old white dude professor types, right? Then, of course, there's like the way that psychedelics, plant medicines have been used like in culture, anthropologically, whatever, among different cultures, different tribes for millennia, as plant medicines. And that, of course, is not, that's anyone in the world, anyone in the world can probably trace their own like personal ethnic history to some tradition that includes a plant, I would say.
Right. Absolutely.
Yeah. And, when I think of the cannabis industry, like, you kind of get a sort of diverse bunch in that, there are this sort of like old hippies from like the Back to the Land movement. And, you also get, like, I guess, culturally, the stereotype is like Rastafarians and Bob Marley and whatever. So like at this point in history, like when we're talking about representation in the cannabis space, like so much of what I would like to be able to do is like shed light on kind of like how the history itself has been disproportionately represented. Does that make sense a little bit?
Yeah. I mean, I think to that extent, I mean, I think about now just kind of telling stories, right? It's a lot about storytelling. It's like, how do we tell stories through brands about these cultures, and how do we represent them in a way that is not corny, but it's like, oh, I'm here. Look at me. I'm present in the space, And I started an account like back in the day. It was called POC Mag, or People of Cannabis. And like, it was just an account of, really great imagery of all, colors of people in the space, like just white people, Black people, Asian people, like everybody, right? But just having real representation. And that was like the account that Hybrid was built on. You know what I mean? in terms of like just account that grew from 0 to like 2,500 followers just off growing really great, representation. And that showed me just off, just the Instagram account that like people were searching just to see themselves, let alone buy a product that was supported or be, like grown by somebody that was, of the culture in that sense. So yeah, I agree.
Cool. And yeah, I mean, another thing that I wanted to get at was how people from different cultures are kind of using the plant in different ways. So, again, when you take this like scientific background or scientific approach, it's like very clinical and very like,
right.
It's not integrated into like the fabric of like the people and the daily lives of, how they're using it. Whereas like indigenous cultures who have used the plant, different plant medicines, whether it's cannabis or ayahuasca or whatever, they're using it in a way where it's connected to their religion and their spiritual path and their community. And so I think there's so much to learn from that type of wisdom that really like the more clinical side of things could use a little bit more of. So
you just hit me like with like 3 synapses, like 3 things in my head just clicked. So like one, I think it reminds me of like an analogy that I would make with like the Entourage effect, where it's like if you're doing the clinical thing, you're only doing CBD, right? You're only doing like this medical thing. You're not really getting the full effect of if THC was present in these other cannabinoids, right? And to that point, it kind of connects back to the name of this podcast, Set and Setting, right? Because the setting that you're talking about where cultures are experiencing the plant medicine in that setting, literally, right? Or, with the mindset and the set, like, so that right there is the entourage effect of that experience, in that way. And it's like, if you take that out and you're only doing the medical aspect, you're not getting the full spiritual healing. So yeah, I get that.
Yeah, I mean, and that's something I wanted to talk to you about too, is like, we're talking about cannabis industry stuff and it's such a hot topic and there's so much like investor money going into it and marketing and all of these sort of like very, businessy conversations when really, for so long, and especially the way I grew up with cannabis, my parents' relationships to it that I observed as a kid, there is so much of a spiritual aspect to it. And cannabis has been for so long deeply ingrained in communities that are also seeking something else beyond the commercial. So my question for you is like, do you have a spiritual practice that is connected to cannabis or, any other psychoactive, I guess I'll say. I won't narrow it down that much.
Yeah. I was going to say, because I think me and shrooms are a little bit more spiritual in that sense. And that's why I think like, even when I hear about like the commercialization of psychedelics, I have a little bit harder time grasping it than I do with weed. Like I have, like weed, I compare more to like a cigarettes type of item where it's like an everyday thing. And then shrooms for me has always been something that's like a little bit more like, we got to go there. I got to go like see myself. I got to go be with myself or something, and like anytime that I'm kind of feeling like moments of transition, sometimes it's like when I would embark on a like trip with shrooms. And so for me, I feel like those were really big. Like I know one of the like notable times that I remember recently was when I was going to go back to my last semester of school, for college. And I was like, all right, I need to like, because after this semester, my life is going to be so different, and it was kind of one of those moments for me to sit and be, internal. And I'm of this generation where I'm like super spiritual, not religious, but still have learned a lot of my spirituality from religion. So have those kind of like tendencies and traits. So there's other things that I do. But in terms of like psychoactives and such, I think shrooms has definitely been like I would say maybe like quarterly or like a few times a year where I kind of use it in that way where I want to get to know myself a little bit better or like feel like I need to go somewhere.
And do you, when, in the regard to the name of this podcast, Set and Setting, like what is the set and setting that's surrounding your cannabis relationship?
I mean, recently it's been, as a break in between work and stuff. I usually take it's like one, and I always try to make sure like be cognizant of like alternating, especially there's other things that I could do instead of using cannabis, right? I think about that sometimes. Like, why? But in general, like the set and setting is typically, like a moment in the day where I can kind of take a minute, reset myself essentially. It's like very much like a reset button, to go back and be energized, because the way weed makes me feel is very much like it doesn't make things easier, but it just makes things happier.
Yeah. Yeah, I hear you.
You know? And that's all I can say about it. Like, I still got to go do that shit, but I just feel better about doing it now, you know? And that, I think, makes all the difference, right?
Right.
So that's how I get through my days. Yeah.
Yeah. Do you see, like, I guess another thing that I've always wanted to see, I guess, in the cannabis space and the psychedelic space is, like, what is the depth of the relationship that people have to the plants that we're working with? So there was just this psychedelic conference in Miami, I think like about a week ago, and my friend was giving me I didn't end up going, but my friend gave me an update, and she said something about like a lot of VCs, very like industry oriented, and a bunch of white guys who've probably never had a mystical experience on psychedelics,
Right.
but here they are. And so my question is, seeing the people who are kind of in the cannabis industry, like how many of them really you think are using this plant for kind of more mystical, spiritual, or at least whatever
Why I
purposes
feel
in
like
that way?
VCs do more psychedelics than they do weed. Like, why do I
Why do you think
like
that's?
that? Like, the part of me just feels like they're doing more shrooms and LSD than they are doing weed. Like, I don't know. But that's just might be me stereotyping, and that's okay too. But I would say, like, I don't necessarily like look for people who are necessarily so ingrained in it. I think I look for more people that are like respectful of the fact that others are ingrained in it. You know what I mean? And understand like they may not be as ingrained as others.
Yeah.
I think that level of kind of self-awareness, and I guess it would be like positionality, right? Of like knowing where you sit in the spectrum of ingrained and not, is me to the most important part, right? Because if I would talk to an investor and they're like, listen, I don't even smoke that much weed, but I know you get it. And I know that this is what I need to do to understand more. And I'm open to doing that. There's a level there of like, okay, we're level setting, right? And I think, not a lot of people have that. There's a lot of people who are super braggadocious, right? And they just like being about themselves and they think they know everything. And I did it in this industry and I can come do it here. And those are the people that I don't talk to, because I was like, maybe it'll work, maybe it doesn't, but I just don't want to deal with you. You know what I mean? So I think everybody should be like open to understanding that they're going to be those people no matter what, and that you should really just be focused on finding your tribe.
I mean, I guess to backtrack on what I was saying a little bit is that it's not a prerequisite to, be having these intense experiences with the medicines in order to be working in the industry. But what I do wish that I saw more of was that the industries themselves reflecting the spirit of the plants. And what I mean by that is, for instance, psychedelic scientists have distilled the quote unquote mystical experience. And so when a patient goes into a trial, whether, it's for end of life anxiety, if they have cancer or, depression or whatever, they might, especially with psilocybin experience, have this quote unquote mystical experience, which is defined by like 7 criteria, one of which is, a sense of unity or oneness. Other one is deeply felt positive mood. There's an ineffability or like an inability just to describe the experience with words, et cetera, et cetera. And specific to this idea of oneness, I think that engenders this feeling of empathy or feeling of, care for the things around you, whether that's the environment or other communities that you see as less distinct or different from yourself. The idea is to feel more collective camaraderie or experience with another person. And then that can come across in the way that an industry operates, right? I think when people are having this sense of oneness with other communities, other people, it'll show in how equity arranges itself. And so, I mean, maybe that's an idealistic or overly philosophical way of looking at it. But, whether it's cannabis or whether it's a psilocybin or anything else, like that's really what my prayer is for the psychedelic space is to, or for the sort of psychedelic and cannabis spaces, for people for the industries to really reflect the ethos of the medicines themselves.
Yeah, I mean, I think like there is a lot of just compared to other industries, this industry does, a little bit, right? Like it does feel a lot more weedy than a lot of other industries that I've been in, so I will give it its props there. But to your point, I don't know if you could say that and not be like, well, we're in America, so it's like weed in Jamaica is different. And I think it does embody that. And maybe the people there, but it's like the culture of the container that we're in also shapes how this industry shapes out. You know what I mean? And so I feel like in that sense, I was prepared for this, right? Because I know what America does to industries. And it does the same thing over and over, which is doing. And we have this level of like resistance that we can have and level of like, let's change the way. But it's funny to me, I feel like the only way to do that is I would still have to make a business that makes me a big ass load of money to then have impact, right? Like, so then I could be the person saying what we want to do and have the influence. You know what I mean? And that's I think the catch-22 of it all.
Right. I mean, do you think, you mentioned Jamaica is a little bit different. Do you know a lot about the way the cannabis industry expresses over there?
Well, I wouldn't say too much. I would just say in the sense of like, it's smaller, and culturally wise, like even just being there and seeing like as a tourist more so, I think seeing that was different in terms of how people cared for each other, right? And like that is different inherently, and it trickles down to the plant. So I think it's very much like trickled down economics, but like psychology.
Got it. So switching gears a little bit, you're like kind of fresh out of college, right? You're
kind of
past couple years, I would say.
Absolutely,
you said you called yourself a Gen Z millennial, right?
Zillennial, yeah.
Okay, cool. So I'm like a proper millennial.
There you go. Yes, you are.
You're like right in the middle, I guess.
I just can't be Gen Z. I just can't. I'm not them.
What is Gen Z to you? Like, I have a 16-year-old sister.
I don't dance. I don't do that.
Yeah, I don't dance. Gen Z to me, these kids are like half human, half like social media beings.
That's what I'm saying. Like my little sister, just like watching her, like Roblox. Don't forget Roblox. Like they're on the Fortnite Roblox metaverse. They're already like prepared for it. Like.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's totally, I mean, what they're growing up with is, you saw, I'm sure, the Social Dilemma, that documentary.
Mm-hmm. Of course.
And the way, the way what I've observed in my little sister, who's again in high school, and my niece and nephew, is that their sense of being and sense of self is so much informed by something that is virtually on the internet rather than like who they are in the real world.
Yeah.
It's super trippy.
It makes me feel like that Black Mirror episode a little bit, like Nosedive. Like where, she's got the social score and people can see it. Like, I feel like that sometimes for sure.
So, generationally, I've been really curious. I grew up with Ram Dass. My parents are, they're in that scene. Be Here Now was kind of like a staple in our household. Mm-hmm. And I was always really embarrassed about it. Like at the point when I was a kid, in elementary school and high school, it was like my home was like the freak show of West LA. Like, there were all sorts of like
in West LA. Damn.
Yeah, I mean, whatever. Especially
that's up there.
I went to Beverly Hills High School, like on the south side of Beverly Hills, whatever. Yep. So like it was, a bunch of like straights pretty much, and then my parents who were, who they are. And it was funny because I would, as a kid, it was like always like my dad's friends, like the old guys coming to the house, sitting around doing like Indian chanting events and meditating and smoking weed.
Oh, wow. Yep.
And then as I got older, the people who would come through became younger and younger and younger, like closer to my age. And I was saying to myself, like, who are these people that like, like these, pretty girls who are 5 years older than me probably, who are like now coming into my house, hanging out with the old guys. Like, what's going on? Like, is this getting more popular? And so my question is, at this point, when you say Ram Dass, especially in the psychedelic world, people are so excited about it. And again,
what is that?
What is Ram Dass?
I don't even know what that is.
So he wrote this book, Be Here Now.
Yep.
He was with a guru in India, Neem Karoli Baba, or kind of also known as Maharaji. And Ram Dass, formerly Richard Alpert, he was worked at Harvard in the psychology department, doing a lot of psychedelic research with Timothy Leary, etc. It went too far, They both got kicked out. I think they, they were some of their experimentation like got into the undergraduate realm, and it was just,
Right.
Harvard kicked them out. And so Timothy Leary went West Coast, San Francisco, Summer of Love, Turn On, Tune In, Drop Out. Ram Dass, basically his whole thing was like, you come up and you come down, and are you really getting that sustainable high, like especially without having to take acid or whatever.
Mhm.
And so he finds himself on this spiritual journey, ends up meeting his guru in India, and distills a lot of the teachings from the guru into this book, Be Here Now. So we're on the Be Here
Gotcha.
Now network. And,
Understood.
it really, he's credited with bringing that sort of like Eastern philosophy back to the West.
Okay.
And
thank you for the education.
Yeah, of course. I mean, for me, I take it for granted because I grew up with it, but I forget that like it's not the most obvious thing. And again, as a kid, I was like, nobody knows who this is, and this is so weird. And
yeah, I don't know. I feel like the funniest thing to me is like learning is the way that I could feel like a kid again.
Mm-hmm.
It's like one of the only times that I genuinely feel like, when like you're teaching me something there, it's like brings me back to when I first started in weed and I had all the questions and now I have the answers, but I got, there's always going to be more questions. But yeah, taking moments like that, I appreciate it. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's part of like what the psychedelic and cannabis state of being does for you is it sort of like de-jades you. Like like you said, it's a reset. And whether that's like a micro reset, you smoke a joint, in the middle of the day, or you do a whole mushroom trip or whatever. It's like gives you a fresh perspective and like unfogs the goggles or whatever. And you're seeing life like a kid. I remember the first time I did mushrooms, I felt like I was like being reborn, and like everything was novel and amazing. And you're like, wow, the world is just so cool as it is.
That's a fact. My first time was like a moment where it was like in college, and I remember just like wanting to be vegan after that. I didn't want my phone. Like during the trip, there were certain things like I just wanted to be outside. Like the feeling of wanting to be outside was like, I didn't even know that was a thing, like in that, like how powerful it felt, you know what I mean? Those moments. So yeah.
Yeah. I mean, and part of what I was getting at, I guess, in this whole anecdote about Ram Dass and whatever is like for the Gen Z or the Zillennial or whatever generation, like so much of the experience is virtual. You could say. And like, how does that relate to then like the internal experience of just like mindfulness and presence and getting into like a somatic flow state, so to speak? When you're expressing yourself.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's super hard, and I can see it. Like my sister's 10 years old, right? Mm-hmm. So it's like a really good age to be looking at this. And, with her, it's hard because, the phones and stuff are just like, as adults, it's hard to not be with them. So as kids, I can't imagine, already what that's doing. But at least I have, a mother who is herself like very yogi, and is into that stuff. So is very intentional about taking my sister to do things that forces you to be present and forces you to put down your phone. You know what I mean? And I think more people are realizing the importance of that, and parents are, but it's also not easy when you can just put a iPhone in your kid's hand and they'll be quiet. You know what I mean? And watch, Shark, Baby Shark. Right. And it's like if that level of pacification too is also like a crutch that parents lean on. So it's a balance of game. Like you need to be engaged with your child, or like as raising folks. But I think with this new age in kind of like for folks coming up, there's a lot more awareness that we have to be intentional. So at least there's more resources out there now, I could say. But if we use those, that's always to be determined.
Right. I mean, another thing is like, is there as much attention being paid in that generation? Maybe not 10-year-olds, but like say college age kids until 25 or something. Like people my age, I'm 30. Everyone's like into psychedelics. They're excited about what's going on. They're into mindfulness. It's like this new trendy thing. And again, it kind of weirds me out a little bit because it wasn't trendy when I was a kid, and it was like the stuff was being shoved down my throat in a lot of ways. And I, come to appreciate it and embrace it. So what does that look like, for a generation who, is growing up with different circumstances, different world events, different whatever, like is mindfulness something that these kids are paying attention to, or is it maybe just something that comes with maturity?
I think it comes with maturity for
Mm-hmm.
sure. I don't know. You know what I mean? Like to want to be mindful and to want to sit still. I don't know if that's intuitive once, like if you're given a phone, like, you know what I mean? Once you're given a phone, I don't know if mindfulness is intuitive, right? Especially if you're programmed to be on a phone and there's something to be minding you all the time.
Mm-hmm.
You know what I mean? The phone's job is to mind me and I mind the phone. Right. And then after that, you know, putting the phone down, even I have trouble myself, like, you know what I mean? Like not picking up my phone.
Mm-hmm.
Like I know it. So I don't know, you know what I mean? So like, I think it's the social dilemma was it's a dilemma currently still happening. I think I'm hoping that more education can mean that some of the trendiness will go away, but it's hard to say because I just know how sometimes people are always searching for this kind of like easy thing, right? And that's what commercialization brings, is like the easy part of it, right? Like it's easy to smoke weed now. It's easy to get shrooms now. It's easy to do that. Before it wasn't easy. So like even in that sense, like you were searching for something, right? Like on that journey. And that could tell more about you than actually getting the thing. You know what I mean? Like how far you went to go get those shrooms, you know, to get that experience. And I feel like now once those barriers are kind of away, it starts to, you know, make it easier for people to kind of fall subject to being lazy about their experiences for sure.
So, you know, my question for you is how do you personally kind of get into flow state, or like, and when I mean flow state, I just mean like, you know, that kind of state of not paying attention to like time, and you're just so absorbed. And you know, it's funny because you know, I find myself scrolling on Instagram half the time, and I'm like, oh God, it's like a flow state, but it's like a bad flow state. It's like like the evil doppelganger of flow state, right?
Yes.
So
it's literally like as you scroll, like productivity is like not there, like, you know. But I hate it because then there's always something that I find on the internet that justifies me being there.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Then I'm like, oh, this person dropped this new product. That's why I'm on here.
Like, yeah, no, totally. Like I'll be scrolling mindlessly and I'm like, wait, like this person's really cool. And, you know, lo and behold, they're my next interview for something, you know?
Yeah.
And so then I justify the 3 hours that I wasted.
Exactly.
But, you know, and it again, it is a weird, I've never thought of like the mindless scrolling as like its own weird black magic flow state or whatever.
It is though.
But what about for you? Like, do you have any, you know, you said you play sports, or, you know, what gets you kind of into that state in a healthier way, I guess?
Yeah. I mean, definitely like, you know, working out is definitely the one way for sure. It's something that I take, and I work out at night. That's the type of person I am. Like I get up and I start working until I burn out for the day. And then I like, all right, it's 9 o'clock. I'm gonna go work out. Mm-hmm. And so that's always a good way for me to like just put down phone, and I still have time, but it's more like for my workout, you know what I mean, itself. And in terms of like me working and catching flow state, I think I've been, you know, that's just more of a music thing. I feel like it's like music and task. And I've been trying to like block out my days a bit better to practice flow state, because I'm very much like an ideas person and not as much an execution person as I like to claim to be. You know, I get shit done, but like, I just feel like if I was more organized, I could get even more done. And that's something that I've been practicing with time. And like, I think that's a maturity thing that we're talking about before in mindfulness, right? It's like, for me to be that aware of like how much, like where I'm spending my time, I think it's something that like, you know, that doesn't come except with time, and other people may be pointing it out to you, or you missing a deadline and you're like, fuck, what did I do? You know, from now till then.
Do you ever use the phone has like the limitations? It can tell you to stop using an app once you hit your time limit. I started doing that, and then I just kept pressing ignore.
Right. It does. It's a true addiction. It's like you got to be ready yourself. Like, and
the week that I did the limitations, it said my usage for the phone was up 18% on screen time.
Right.
So I'm like, this is the opposite effect of what I wanted to see happen.
I think what I do is I tell myself one thing at a time. That's like my like internal thing. I'm like, are you doing more than one thing at a time? Stop doing the other thing. Do the main thing that you said you were going to do and move on. Like I try to like do that to myself a lot. Like,
and does when you smoke weed, does that help with that, or does it make you want to do multiple things at once?
Sometimes it's no, weed is because I don't really like smoke too much weed while I work, if that makes sense. You know, I it's like more, you know, it's a separate thing. So I would say smoking weed just kind of helps me, like, for example, like I'll work on this one project till I get tired, and then I kind of get to that point where you feel like you're not being as productive anymore. And then I'm like, let me go smoke weed, and then I come back and do something else.
Yeah.
You know, so that's usually how I do it. Like, come back, just leave that shit because you're tired of it. You're fatigued from like just doing that exercise. Do a new exercise because you're not really tired. You know what I mean? You're just fatigued from that one thing.
Right. Okay. Yeah. I mean, you know, so often I think people have different relationships to cannabis or to psychedelics, and like whether they like use it to work or they use it to relax or like start thinking, you know, it repatterns the brain in a lot of ways.
Yeah, I take a lot of calls. Like I FaceTime a lot of people while I smoke. I have a lot of like, I call my friends. You know what I mean? Like while I smoke, I'm like, beep, 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 beep. I have like, you know, 4 or 5 people that I like FaceTime while I smoke, and then I like Russian roulette them. And that's always like a good way for me to feel rejuvenated because like I like talking to people just like my friends. Like, you know, I was like, that's always a good,
Yeah, totally. One thing I also wanted to get on is, you know, when we're talking about like cannabis culture and psychedelic culture and, you know, these sort of like alternate meditative type expressions of the culture and whatever, is like you worked at High Times, right? And High Times is a legacy organization. And they, you know, they for so long have been, they occupied all of this, you know, when High Times first began, if I recall, like the first issue, the cover I think had mushrooms on it. And it wasn't, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, or I don't know if you know, but like, was High Times always specifically a cannabis publication, or was it, you know, just like all drugs pretty much?
Yeah, I mean, I'll speak from what I know, right? And at least what I know is like the, you know, High Times in the counterculture sense, you know, in the sense of like being everything that's, you know, mainstream wasn't, you know, and weed was the starting point, but obviously weed and shrooms are, you know, cousins and best friends, you know, and they hang out all the time. So in that sense, I know that there's definitely, you know, odes to all of that in a time where like what you're doing was already illegal. How much different is it to do this illegal thing versus that illegal thing, you know? You know, and I don't think people from the outside looking in were also categorizing it any differently as well, right? It's like if you did weed, you did shrooms to them from the outside, right? And so in that sense, I think it's definitely supremely important, you know, on a legacy staple. I don't, you know, I worked at High Times, you know, for a period of time. Like, you know, I took off from school to work there, you know, so I wasn't working there for like 6-12 months or nothing like that. But even in that time being there, you could see how far that legacy went and how much that meant to people so early on in, you know, 70s, 80s and so forth when what was out there, right? Now there's double blind. Now there's 100, you know, different niches that people are diving into.
Right. So, you know, another question, it's actually, I was just thinking, were your parents okay with the fact that you took off from school to go work at High Times? Did that go over well?
Yeah, it went over great.
Yeah. I mean, that just shows like so much of like how things are changing, right? Like I mean, again, my parents wouldn't have cared either at that, you know, but they're
well,
like
you gotta
very
think, right? Like
pro-weed people.
We did like an event with High Times at Brown. So we did a High Times in Leafly, like at a university type of thing, at Ivy League for that matter, right? So we did that event. It was really good. We had speakers there. Shalene Title was there. Hope Wiseman was there. Growers locally, all that stuff. So my mom was there at that event. You know, and so she got to see the full manifestation of like these relationships. And, you know, we had over 100 people got written up on High Times, right? Like that was a really good splash that allowed me to then go work at High Times and then be like, okay, you did a good job doing this. We can, you know, hire you for this time. So I would say that level of success will allow for parents to feel confident, right? You hear that time and time again. My parents weren't as cool with it until I did this. You know, my mom was always cool with it, but in general, like the security is there when you see somebody working and making progress.
Yeah, totally. And, you know, I think that just goes to show, like, whenever anyone has a relationship with a psychedelic or cannabis or whatever, like, the judgment is like on, is your life working for you? Like, you know, are you successful? Are you healthy? Are you whatever? Then, like, whatever you're doing, just like keep it up, or just doesn't matter. But,
Yep.
you know, one thing I wanted to ask is, like, High Times is sort of this expression of the counterculture. And
Hmm.
at this point in time, with like the mainstreaming of cannabis and psychedelics and the mainstreaming of, you know, meditation and like all the things that Ram Dass had, you know, again, like kind of introduced to a lot of people. What is counterculture today? You know, what counts as counterculture when the things that were once
Oh my
counterculture are mainstream?
jeez. Oh my God. I know, right? Like that's so hard. Um, it's so hard, and it makes me sad ultimately, right? Because there's like nothing is like everything is for everybody now. You know, there's nothing that's just for us anymore. And it's not to be like gatekeepy, right? It's to be like, not everything is for everybody. You know, as a Black person, I get that. As a woman, you get that, right? Like,
Mm-hmm.
it's like some things are for us, some things are for you know. And so all that's to say is, in terms of like what is counterculture, right? Like that's the question.
Yeah.
I think it's more about like now there's just more having to do like due diligence, and there's more like you got to bring receipts now a little bit, right? Like how do you prove that you really about this? You know what I mean? I think that's kind of how you're judged a little bit more nowadays, and I feel like that's how it is in weed, right? It's like I was in Sacramento for 13 years before this shit started. Like, you know, everybody's kind of showing like what they did before it became super popular, you know, and so I think in that sense, is a lot of like showmanship in that way right now, like
Mm-hmm.
signaling, and that's how people do it. How do you determine? You know, for me, I see it like this, right? Like High Times example, you brought them up, right? Like High Times is so far gone from like there's people in there that are bringing it back. You know, shout out John Capetta, like he's doing what he can. But as an overall organization for the past 5 to 10 years, right? Like if you objectively look at them, they've been, you know, distancing themselves from that true culture. And then that comes with, again, the corporate stuff. It comes with a lot of things. And for me, that's where I get excited because we've seen the failures of corporate businesses trying to just jump on cannabis and try to win. And, oh, we're going to just throw money at it. And like that didn't work because they didn't understand the customer. They didn't understand the culture. They didn't understand who was buying the product and why they were buying the product. And that is like the deep, intimate knowledge of like having been here. And for me, I feel like, you know, I'm still learning, but a way that we can start to create our own abodes, you know, like that's why I like Double Blind, because I know you're running the ship over here and I know who's behind it. And for me, it feels like that's what's going to win long term, you know, is like those people who are curating a community. And curation is not an easy thing to do, right? Like curating who's going to be here, who's going to speak, who's going to make, you know, this experience feel true.
Mm-hmm.
Is something that everybody's looking for. They want to feel like a true experience. And so I'm, you know, optimistic that there's folks like myself and others in the space that are vying for that we could, you know, find our little bubble, and that'll be the bubble that we can prove to people that is the real thing.
Right. Do you think that drug culture will always be sort of countercultural, like just in terms of embracing, you know, these like, you know, yes, like cannabis is becoming mainstream, but like by and large, like society, you know, I
It's still,
forget that
yeah,
it's, you know, I forget that maybe it's still like not as
that's
easy.
cool, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, I know. I be catching myself sometimes. I'm like, maybe I shouldn't smoke out in the open here. Like,
Right.
um, so yeah, so
I'm,
you were saying like, yeah, sorry, keep
oh
going.
no, go on. Go on.
No, you go.
No, I mean, I was just trying to like understand, like when we talk about mindfulness, when we talk about all these things, like maybe counterculture is a Gen Zer who's not on TikTok.
And that's actually what it is, I think, you know, honestly, because it just counterculture is always against what the main flow is, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that's why you even see like the non-alcoholic people, that being a trend, right? Because our society has been such a, you know, inebriated with alcohol and all that stuff. And now counterculture is to go against alcohol, right? So it could be counterculture now is more so that I'm Cali sober, right? Versus I'm, you know, I drink and I smoke, right? Like,
Right.
I feel like me, I'm more mainstream because I drink, you know,
Right.
and I smoke versus my friends are like, oh, I don't drink. And I'm like, ooh, look at you. You're not drinking. All right. Like, you know, so I think definitely to your point, that's a good way to think about it as well. It's like just a little bit more of the variation than what was the heavy drinking. We only, I drink and I smoke cigarettes. Like for me was the classic kind of what I seen people do growing up.
Yeah.
So yeah.
Yeah. Cool. Well, is there anything else that we didn't talk about that you want to add or discuss or just kind of touch on during the interview?
I could just say that, hopefully people can better discover culture at Hybrid. That's kind of the big thing that we're pushing over there. Like shameless plug, right? Is like making it so that people can better find the things that matter in culture and like actually moving people, not just like you go on ease and you find like the bullshit pre-rolls of the day there. Like, no, like what's actually being dropped in the space. And you got me thinking on like the double blind side and like the psychedelic side and like how do we incorporate that community into what we have going on? Because there are a lot of things dropping and happening, experiences, right, that like people want to be able to discover, and Instagram is not the happiest place to do that right now.
Yeah. I mean, one thing that you just said that I kind of want to like parlay into sort of practical advice is, for the listeners out there who enjoy cannabis, how can you be a conscious cannabis consumer, right? Like when you're purveying different dispensaries or, figuring out like what brand you want to buy from or whatever, like do you have tips that would just like help people kind of engage the best that cannabis culture today has to offer?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a good thing that I'll write down so that we can make better filters for people to find, how, people are committing on the sustainability side. I know, at least Cannaclusive has been doing the accountability list for a long time, which is like more of an account of what companies are doing organizationally. You know what I mean? Not necessarily, some of it may have to do with their supply chain and who their vendors are and who they're, supporting the operation. But some of it is just like, is that company being true to its mission and supporting different cultures and communities that need it? And I think that's, if that matters to you, definitely do that due diligence because they do make that available online, for these folks. But yeah, then continue to kind of rely on folks like Cannaclusive, ourselves at, gethybrid.co, where we're like obviously caring a lot more about, what's going in to, the quality and care more about, what you smoke and our reputation attached to that, right? Because we want people to trust us, and trust is like, to me, the biggest thing in this industry, period.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think that's part of it is like when you're looking at culture, it's like who's leading the culture. And I think that's where the trust really comes in. Why so much of like, for instance, with people like Timothy Leary, who were seen as like these rascals, people stopped trusting him. And I think that had an effect on whether people were trusting psychedelics. And so now we're kind of I don't want to say redoing it, but building off of like the foundations from before. And so I just want to say thank you for all the work that you're doing and pushing cannabis culture forward and the industry forward in ways that are equitable and really hope, I'd say reflective of the values, of the plants themselves. So really appreciate your work.
I like super appreciate you for keep messaging me to get on this call because that's all I need a little bit is like another follow-up. And because I really wanted to be here and I really appreciate this conversation and got me to think a lot more about myself. I haven't done a podcast in a long time. So thanks for getting the rust off of me.
Yeah, of course. And how can people find you on social media or learn what you're up to or just,
Yeah. I'm just Nadir Pearson, Nadir, and then pear like the fruit, son like I'm your child, on Instagram, on Twitter. So yeah, definitely reach out.
All right, cool. Well, thank you so much.
All right. Have a good day.